clients think, oh, I'm going to get all this money and then I'm going to ride off into the sunset. And yeah, you probably are, but you better not spend it all because there is a potential that you could have some liability down the line.
Welcome to the Middle Market Moment, where we speak to other professionals who help business owners build value, de-risk their companies, and prepare both personally and professionally to do the deal of a lifetime through M&A. I'm excited to welcome Kathleen Burton. Kathleen is a partner at Stokes Lawrence. She's a partner in the firm's business group, which means she handles mergers and acquisitions, representing buyers and sellers in all types of equity and asset transfers. She also advises on general corporate law and assists with contract drafting and negotiation for all sorts of contracts and corporate issues. And many of her clients use her as an outside general counsel. And in addition to her M&A and business advisory practice, Kathleen works closely with family businesses, owners, and executives on succession planning. Kathleen, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Outstanding. Well, our folks, and just to kind of recap a little bit, the folks that watch our vlog, as we call it, we're not podcasting. We're not committing to that just yet, but we want to attach, the face and the human, right? Are people that are thinking about transferring typically their largest asset, which is their business. They're actively preparing, or they're vetting people that should be on the deal team, whether it be an M&A attorney, a CPA firm that can kind of supercharge their efforts towards getting prepared, and even their wealth managers and people that will manage the wealth and, most importantly, plan for that transaction. So we want to give them some insights as to how, you on the law side can really help them prepare to sell. And maybe that starts with unpacking a little bit more about your practice. Tell us more, I read the areas that you cover, but maybe tell us a little bit more from your perspective, how you help clients in those practice areas.
Sure. So I represent privately held middle market companies across industries. I don't have an industry specialty, but I deal with a lot of agriculture, professional services, construction, distribution companies. That's just sort of some of the industries I've been working on recently. I like to describe myself as an outside general counsel. So we advise businesses on anything that they'll need during their operations. Usually we'll be the first call, if anything happens at the business that they need legal advice for, whether it's an employment law or some kind of a contract or a new venture they're planning on starting. They'll give me a call and I'll put them in touch with one of the others in my firm if it's not something I can handle myself. And then a big part of it is equity transfers. So it's often, it could be an employee buying an interest, or a family where one generation is transferring to another, or there's good old M&A with third parties, which is actually the favorite part of my practice. So we kind of laugh about the term M&A because that stands for mergers and acquisitions, but I've only worked on one major merger. Everything else is straight up acquisition. The other mergers I've worked on are just administrative restructurings of a single company. So M&A sometimes feels like a little bit of a misnomer. It's really an acquisitions attorney.
Yes. We feel the same way. We get involved in very few mergers, mostly acquisitions, whether it be on the buy side or sell side. So yeah, the M is, it's hard to bring people together.
Yeah. And yeah, so now my colleagues joke I'm a real M&A attorney because I'm working on a merger. So that's a little silly. I represent both the buy side and the sell side. On the buy side, my clients are either strategic buyers where, they'll have a transaction maybe once every couple of years and they're using it strategically to grow, or because they're seeing some business reason for purchasing a company. The other buyers are private equity firms, and those are serial buyers. So they're just, several high transaction volume, usually all within the same industry. And those are fun because they're very sophisticated clients. They've been through it many times before. And every time we present the same forms or the same deal documents to a new target, we get a different reaction. So it's really fun to be able to compare transactions in that way, which you can't usually do because everything is so different. And then on the sell side, we represent our longstanding business clients, which is always a little bit sad because it means they're retiring and they might not be our client after the acquisition, or after the sale. But it's really feels really good to see them achieve that big payday and the culmination of what they've been working for their whole life. So that can be really rewarding. And then the rest of my sell clients are people that find me because they are ready to sell, or they sometimes even have a buyer in mind. They've got a term sheet or an LOI that they're thinking about signing. And we always tell them, make sure you contact your lawyer before you sign the term sheet or the LOI, as I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they say that they're not binding, but it can be very difficult to walk back from major deal points that were agreed to at the beginning. And especially if you're agreeing to deal points without having the perspective of, what your liability is going to be post-closing and other legal risks that we bring up. So it's helpful to have that full picture before you start making commitments.
Yeah, I can't emphasize that enough. It's true of your attorney. It's true of your CPA, right? I don't know how many deals where, we get brought in because someone has signed an LOI, hasn't talked to their attorney, goes to their CPA and say, what's my tax ramification of this? When that's exactly the opposite of how it should go, right? Let's structure a deal that's tax advantageous to you, the seller, with all the parties and stakeholders involved, starting with the attorney, the CPA, and the investment banker. So, yeah, sometimes we have to reverse the clock a little bit, right?
Yeah, totally.
Well, just a little bit too about Stokes Lawrence. I know you're a firm that has various specialties. While you talked about some of the industries that you cover, you have folks in your firm that deal specifically with tax and with other areas around potentially whether it's a business need or an M&A need. You have some specialists on your team that you work with as well, right?
Yeah, so Stokes is a general service firm. So we have generally all the practice areas. We've got litigators, we've got intellectual property, real estate, employment, estate planning. Mostly what I cross with is employment, because the employment lawyers will help with the diligence for a business. And they have that expertise to be able to spot issues and give me a sense of what the liability is on those. Real estate, often there's real estate involved in a transaction, so it's nice to have those specialists. Intellectual property comes up in deals. It's just really nice to have specialists in-house where I can just go ask a question where it's maybe not something so significant that we would want to bring in an outside counsel, but the fact that I have somebody here who has that expertise, it's just easy to walk down the hall and bounce some ideas off them. What do you think about this? Or am I coming on to something here? Or is this just a nothing issue? So that's a really helpful thing about Stokes.
Yeah, that's terrific. I say to clients, because we generally know that outcomes and managing the risk around an M&A transaction, you have to have an M&A attorney who knows the market, knows what current indemnities look like, and all of those things, and rather than just somebody who may have been a fantastic, counsel over the years for growing your company, but really you need specialized help and support, and you don't want to train your attorney on your deal, right? So it really makes sense to have a full team and a full complement. And speaking of that, let's kind of start at the beginning in terms of preparation from a legal lens. How do you help clients kind of prepare for what, you mentioned this culmination of their career and a large liquidity event? How do you guys approach that as a firm, and how do you do it individually?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, if we have a client that's thinking about selling, ideally they'll let us know a few years in advance, because we can help line up the service providers that they're going to need to get this done. You alluded to this at the beginning, that really putting the deal team together is a huge part of getting a transaction going and figuring out how smooth it's going to be, making sure you've covered all these angles from the beginning and you're setting yourself up for success. So the first thing to think about really isn't about the deal, it's about the seller personally. What number do they need to get in order to have the lifestyle that they want in retirement? Or what really are they hoping to achieve from selling their business? And that's really a financial planner question. Something to think about for the seller. How long do I want to be working? What am I trying to achieve by selling my business?
Mhm.
Next step then is trying to get a sense of, well, if I were to sell now, will I meet my number? What is my business worth? And we tend to find clients are either really undervalue their business or really overvalue their business. So they think there's no way I could possibly sell my business now. Like there isn't a buyer. I haven't even thought about this. Who would I contact? There's no way I've reached my goal. And then others who have a very inflated sense of what the business should be worth. And then if they do hear from a buyer, they do get some interest. It's sort of like, well, that's not at all what I was thinking. So one of the keys about that is to set their expectations properly for where they are in the market. And that's where you come in, Craig, to help clients value their business. And I think valuations from an investment bank are particularly helpful because you guys are so close to the market that it's a really informed market position versus just looking at the business in a vacuum and trying to value it based on its financial statements. So I think that would be part 2. So know what you're trying to achieve, figure out whether you're able to achieve it. And then from the legal side, start to think about whether you have your ducks in a row. So often clients don't even think about their corporate documentation because they just formed their company maybe 30 years ago. And now we're asking them to dust off their stock certificates that are up in somebody's attic, and they're trying to find these things that haven't really made a lot of difference in their life up until now. When they're born and when they're getting sold is kind of the times that we find people are looking for their corporate documentation. So getting that ready to go, because that just signals to any buyer that you have been running a business that's ready for prime time, that you have your minute book, you have your corporate documents ready to go. If there was any issue, you've already had an affidavit of loss certificate. It just shows that you've been running a good business, and it sends a really good message to a buyer.
If I had $1 for everyone who has misplaced their certificates or do not have updated minutes, I would be on a beach somewhere right now for sure. Yeah, it's the part of that preparation, and while it's documentation, there's ramifications, not only as you alluded to from a buyer's perspective, so much of the buyer equation, and while we talk about EBITDA and multiples and all that kind of fun stuff, it's buyer trust. And they have to know that you've been running a professionalized business, not just a lifestyle business, especially for larger transactions and more sophisticated buyers. And that includes some of the things from a legal framework that, they have in place relative to their governance, to their structure. And we even see folks that are, C Corps formed 30 years ago that they don't realize that they have a tax issue as a C Corp when they go to sell, for example. Some of those things, really checking in with your attorney and saying, here's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about selling in 3 to 5 years. What should I really be looking at here, or how should we get prepared? Man, if we've got a seller that is receptive to that makes the transaction go much smoother.
And it's especially important if there's multiple owners in the business and not all the owners have set out in an LLC agreement how they're going to handle an exit. Everybody then assumes that the other partners are thinking the same way as them, and we often find that that's not the case. So it's important to get that set up correctly from the beginning, but if it hasn't been, then to iron that out before you try to introduce a third party into the equation.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've got a couple of instances where we've got disparity in age and what the quote unquote sellers or would be sellers want to do. Some want to stay, some want to go. And many sellers in the beginning, the one document that they miss, they may address it in a shareholder agreement in some fashion, but without a lot of specificity, is buy sell.
Yeah.
And it shows up when one wants out and the other doesn't. What do we do? Do we flip a coin? Do we argue? Do we, how does that work? Have you encountered that much with your practice where the buy sell is not really replete?
Yeah, that's often usually when there's usually that comes up in disputes. So when we're helping clients form their business, we're of course going to put all the buy sell information into their LLC agreement. We've got to make them think through all the different scenarios of what could happen and prepare them for that so that everybody knows going in how they're going to get out. And if they haven't done that, then there's a lot of, if the parties are all getting along, it's a lot of negotiation about what each party wants to do now when you have a better idea of the value of the business, and which is higher usually than when they first got started. and somebody is wanting out. So it's, there's just more variables on the table when you're trying to negotiate it at the end than if you had negotiated it at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what, you touched on a couple of things relative to pursuing liquidity. And a lot of folks, sign the LOI and now what, right? Other folks take the route of being meticulously prepared. Any other misconceptions do you think, clients may have relative to what I call the cost of liquidity, right? What are my risks going forward? How long am I going to have to work with this new buyer? All the transition issues, and maybe even any misconceptions about, working with an iBank. I know there are some folks, and you guys get called in to manage a transaction where they do it without an investment bank.
Mm-hmm.
So you're negotiating the deal sometimes and along with the client, but maybe cover some misconceptions if you can, just from your history and your practice.
Sure. I think the biggest misconception is that you can just toss over the keys to a business and be done with it.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost certainly going to be some post-closing liability, whether it's an indemnification or an aspect of the business that hadn't been run perfectly, where there is some risk and the buyer doesn't want to assume that risk. It's very difficult to ever sell a business without having anything that could go wrong afterwards. So that's the kind of the biggest thing. Clients think, oh, I'm going to get all this money and then I'm going to ride off into the sunset. And yeah, you probably are, but you better not spend it all, because there is a potential that you could have some liability down the line. If you've got a good lawyer, that liability is going to be capped and subject to a time bar with indemnification cap and limit on the survival of the reps and warranties. So there are ways to limit that, and that's my job to help clients make their way through. But the fact is that you're not going to be able to get out with no success, no liability afterwards. So that's kind of a big deal. And then the structure of the purchase price is often something clients often think, for sure, my business is going to perform the same or better than it did with me under this new buyer. And so they'll agree to things like earnouts, and they're in their head thinking, I'm absolutely going to get this earnout. How could I possibly not? And many, many times the business doesn't meet the marks that have been set for them to get the earnout. And so if you feel like your business, the value really includes that earnout, you need to get that as purchase price up front, because if that's what your business was worth at the time of the deal, that's what you should get, rather than this future payout that may or may not come. So I think those are two big misconceptions. I think working with an investment bank, I think people think that they'll work with the investment bank just to find a buyer, and they don't realize that there's so much more that an investment bank can do to help them structure the deal, industry knowledge that investment banks have, valuation ability, and just having another business savvy partner in there to help you, advise you during the deal. It's really useful.
Yeah, that's definitely, sellers come to transactions with a lot of misconceptions, and that cost of liquidity. You kind of touched upon it. Maybe let's talk about. It's been said that value in a transaction is one part what you've built and your streams of cash flows, right, and your EBITDA, and you amassed a certain amount of profit in the machine here. And then there's the risk of those future streams of cash flows, right? And ultimately a buyer is betting on that those cash flows will continue. So maybe start to lean in a little bit into, indemnity and risk reduction, and some of those concepts that, everybody focuses on the top line. Oh, I sold for 60 million, but it's how much cash did you get and how much did you get in the end, and how much liability transfer was there away from you over to the buyer and vice versa. So maybe lean into some of that, if you will.
Sure. I think the first question we'll always ask is it an asset sale or an equity sale? An asset sale is going to be better for a seller. Better for a buyer. For one thing, they get a step up in basis. And for another thing, they don't take on the liability of the business. They're only taking on liabilities associated with the assets that they're purchasing. Mm-hmm. A seller is going to prefer an equity sale, usually because it's tax advantage to the seller, and also because they're passing on a business as a going concern. And the buyer then has to be comfortable that the business was run properly and that they're taking over a business that could have liabilities from the past. So that's the first question in the structure is it equity or assets? And then, usually there's going to be some kind of a working capital adjustment. So that's your first, you get your top line, here's the number, and then it's like, oh, but it's going to be adjusted right at closing based on how things were that day. And here's how we're going to calculate that. And then there's often some deferred portion of the purchase price that's paid by a promissory note or some other mechanism that there's some risk there because there could be a default on the payment and then you don't get what you were expecting. Or part of it is structured as an earnout and then time will tell whether you get those benchmarks. And that's particularly fraught because you're no longer in control of the business. So you can put in an operating covenant saying you're going to run it this way and you're not going to close this line of business that will get me this earnout, but you don't have control anymore. So that's a difficult thing. And then when you're talking about the reps and warranties, that's where a business owner is making statements about their business that have to be true. And if they're not true, then they're subject to an indemnification claim if the buyer experiences some loss based on that rep not being true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the frustrating thing for sellers, and as they go through that, you mentioned representations and warranties and indemnity, and then the last piece of that puzzle is disclosures. Oftentimes sellers get frustrated because they have to, rep a certain thing not happening that they may not know about in their business, right? And it doesn't necessarily seem fair. How do you try and kind of contain that? Obviously there's fundamental representations that if you, commit fraud, you're going to be in trouble. But if there's things that you don't know about or something happens with the business, how do you try to bucket that risk, if you will? That might be a good thing for our audience to understand a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the seller's interest to over disclose. So we want to say everything about the business so that the buyer can't later say, I didn't know about this. So step one is over disclose. Sometimes clients are nervous to bring up to their lawyer even something that they're not sure about, like, hey, we had this thing happen. I'm not sure if we dealt with it the right way. Always tell your lawyer. That's kind of a basic advice. And then your lawyer is probably going to tell you, let's tell the buyer. But when you're trying to sell something, you're trying to put your best foot forward. It can be very scary to, tell the buyer about all the warts. But it is in your best interest to do that because then you're putting it all out in the open and you're allocating the risk for those things intentionally in the purchase agreement. Another way we do it is with knowledge qualifiers. So we'll say, instead of saying there's never been a claim, or that's not a good example, there's never been, we've never violated any law. You could say, to our knowledge, we've never violated any law. And then knowledge is defined as the actual knowledge of these certain individuals. And then there'll be a fight over whether it should be the actual knowledge or the constructive knowledge, which means they should have known. And then there's a fight over whether they have to conduct reasonable inquiry. So it kind of goes down to a lot of details. But to an M&A lawyer, they're very standard negotiation that you have in every deal. Like, which ones are we going to put knowledge qualifiers on? Which ones are we going to narrow? Like, how is knowledge going to be defined? And then when you get into the indemnification, there's baskets and caps that you can use to try to limit that liability and make it a little bit more certain. So a basket would be that you don't have to indemnify until the claim reaches the basket amount. And then once it reaches the basket amount, you won't have to indemnify over the cap amount. So then you have more certainty of, it's not just whatever the liability is what I have to pay. It's, you're not going to have to pay more than this cap no matter what, which is one of the most powerful things for sellers, because that's really what they want to understand is, I'm going to get this much money in the purchase price. How much do I need to save in my account in case there's a problem later? And that indemnification cap really helps them think that through.
Yeah, that's a great word. And it's, it's not how much you sell for, it's how much you keep in the end. And when you're talking about, caps and baskets and really trying to reduce the risk in the future that you may or may not have knowledge of or may not have control over, I mean, that is really where the great M&A attorneys that we work with, help buyers. Help sellers. they they focus on the top line, but this is where the real meat and potatoes at the end, when your, promissory note is paid off 5 years, 3 years, whatever it is, right? If there's a seller note involved, or when your earnout is paid out in full because, there weren't issues that popped up or that you were protected from. It's almost the best way to win a gunfight is to never enter it because you've done the work up front, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's definitely I can't overemphasize how important having knowledgeable M&A counsel that knows what market is. And oftentimes, the buyer is the one that, in many instances, that's preparing the documents, the legal documents. So you're kind of getting a document that, despite what opposing counsel might say is a down the middle of the road, seller buyer neutral type document, I've never seen one yet. I've seen ones that are more fair than others, but if a buyer's authoring that document, it's going to be slanted in their favor, and certainly start there. And it's up to you to hire a good investment banker and a good attorney who kind of work as a dynamic duo and take runs at the buyer and the buyer's counsel to really hammer out a good deal on the terms and the legal documents associated with them. So
Definitely. I think people have this conception of lawyers as always saying no and thinking about the worst case scenario, but that is our job is to uncover all the risks that the client may not be thinking about and lay them out for them in a way that they can make a judgment call, which is what they do every day. They're business people exercising their business judgment, and we're just helping them do that by framing the issues in a way to let them understand the risks and the rewards.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. My mom was an attorney. She was mostly a tax attorney, but I remember her sitting me down and talking about, look, you get married, let's plan for divorce, right? Mm-hmm. You're 20 something, let's plan for death, right? It's like, okay, mom, this is a really tough topic. I'm not ready for these big boy topics. But really, I mean, that's just wise. That's sage counsel, that if it doesn't go perfectly, what is my risk? If it doesn't go perfectly or something, comes up post close, how can I limit that risk? And how can I share that risk with the buyer, because they are taking a risk in buying the company. So yeah, it's definitely, a lot of people want to focus on the glamour and the top number, but man, having all of your legal matters buttoned up and bucketing that risk is really worth having great counsel on. Let me ask you on a different topic relative to, just, we'll have some fun with this. Like, what is your favorite kind of deal to work on? And maybe share some of the dynamics that, we're in a people business. You and I, we deal with all sorts of different clients. And while the company is the baby and that's the item that's being transferred, we're often dealing with entrepreneurs and humans. So maybe share from your perspective, favorite types of not only deals to work on, but people to work with.
Yeah, I love working with business owners because they are so enthusiastic about their business, and it's their baby. They've been working on this, their whole life usually. And to see it come to a culmination it's really amazing to be able to write that email saying, congratulations, you're closed, and the money hits their account. And it's a really good, rewarding feeling that I think attorneys in other practice areas don't always get to experience. They say, like, if you've settled litigation, each party should be unhappy and think that they didn't quite get what they wanted. But with a good M&A deal, everybody should feel good that they got what they wanted. So it's nice to be able to build things rather than fight over the pieces. So I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. No, that's a great perspective. And I was just thinking about, and I've told this story before, but I saw a seller in the airport just living. He and his wife were there, and they're living their dream, right? So every seller has this perspective of, here's what I'm going to do, and the freedom and the flexibility that maybe selling my company affords me. But man, when you get to see the smiles and you get to see the post-close reward, even if it's several years later, it probably makes them appreciate all the blood, sweat, and tears as to what it takes to build this company over time.
Yeah, especially because the sale process is pretty onerous. I think a lot of sellers are surprised, especially with the due diligence. they tell me it's like a second job. I'm trying to run my business and trying to respond to all these requests is like a second job. And it is. It's, I'm working on it full time. So
Yeah,
it's a
exactly.
lot of work. And then to get to the end point is really rewarding.
Well, awesome, Kathleen. This has been a fun conversation. I appreciate your perspective. Any parting thoughts, maybe, as we think about the current market and the current market conditions, any comments on the general market or what you're seeing, or any changes from, some of the documentation or buyers' perspectives that you're having to kind of navigate through when you're working with sellers?
I think generally I'm seeing M&A activity pick up, um,
Mhm.
especially at the beginning of this year and coming now towards the end of Q1. So that's good news because it means a lot of people are transacting. Maybe it's a good time to start thinking about selling. Um, I forgot what was the second part of your question.
Oh, well, just relative to what you're seeing, we saw, for example, a uptick in earnouts as buyers were a little bit risk off for the last couple of years
Hmm.
with interest
Yeah.
rates, going up. And I don't know if there's just anything else. We've also seen an uptick in the use of rep and warranty insurance.
Hmm.
Anything from your perspective that you're seeing there?
I think globally, on a long-term basis, we're going to see rep and warranty insurance make its way down into smaller deals. I've definitely
Hmm.
seen an increase in interest in reps and warranty insurance, and usually it's only used in very high value dollar deals, but I think it's coming down to be sort of a standard. Not there yet, but that's my prediction for the future. I think with private equity, we've been seeing a lot of rollover transactions where the seller retains a minority stake in the business after they sell. Doesn't necessarily work for somebody who wants to retire, but for somebody who wants a liquidity event and no longer wants to have the risk of owning an entire business, it's a really good solution.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. And we've seen a lot more add-ons too, whereas the portfolio investments have been really picky, and the add-ons have, from a numbers standpoint, there's been a lot more add-on activity, especially among the private equity buyers out there. So definitely interesting times. Well, thanks for joining me on the Middle Market Moment, Kathleen. It's been fun. Maybe share with our audience, ways to get in touch with you if they want to reach out and learn a little bit more about you and your practice, and maybe what they can do to get the ball rolling, if you will, on that planning and preparation side of it.
Sure. I think the easiest way to find me is just Google Kathleen Burton Stokes Lawrence, and you'll be able to find my bio. It's got my email, it's got my direct line on there. The firm's phone number is 206
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Kathleen, and thanks for everyone listening. And good luck on your journey to the deal of a lifetime.